The gunshot was a deafening crack that shattered the sleepy afternoon calm of redemption. Hollis Vane, a man who measured his life in the neat, predictable columns of a ledger, flinched so violently he sent a stack of banknotes fluttering to the floor of the First Territorial Bank. He was on his knees in an instant, not out of bravery, but out of a deep, instinctual need to be small, to be unseen. Through the legs of tables and terrified patrons, he saw them 4 riders, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, their movements practiced and brutal. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man, with an air of theatrical command, strode to the center of the room. "A contribution, folks," he announced, his voice a gravelly boom that promised violence. "For the future prosperity of this fine territory." Hollis's world had shrunk to the space beneath his accounting desk. He pressed his cheek against the cool, oiled wood, his breath catching in his throat. He was an accountant, a creature of ink and paper. Conflict was an abstract concept, a set of unbalanced figures to be reconciled, not a terrifying reality of smoke and shouting. He just needed to stay hidden to let the chaos pass over him like a summer storm. Then he saw it. As the leader swung a heavy canvas sack onto the counter, his horse tethered just outside the open door, shifted in the sunlight. Dangling from a leather tie on the saddlebag was a small silver locket, intricately carved with the shape of a soaring hawk. It caught the light and sent a blinding flash straight into Hollis's memory. The world of the bank dissolved, replaced by the relentless, baking sun of the prairie 15 years ago. He was a boy again, huddled in the back of a Conestoga wagon, the air thick with the smell of dust and his mother's wildflower perfume. She was wearing the locket, a gift from his father, its hawk, a symbol of the freedom they sought in the West. He remembered the sudden, terrifying thunder of hooves, the splintering crash of wood, and a man's voice younger then, but with the same cruel confidence, shouting orders. He remembered his father's final defiant cry, and his mother's scream abruptly silenced. And he remembered the locket ripped from her neck before the world went dark. The memory was so vivid, so all-consuming, that a strangled gasp escaped his lips. The bank robber's leader, whose name he would later learn, was Jim Morrison, turned his head, his eyes narrowing on the sound. He saw the movement under the desk. A slow, predatory smile spread across the visible portion of his face. "Well now," Morrison drawled, taking a step toward Hollis's hiding place. "Looks like we have a mouse in the house." He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking an obscene punctuation mark in the terrified silence. He aimed it at the bank manager, Thomas Reed, who was trembling behind the counter. "Tell your little bookkeeper to come out, or the only accounts you'll be settling are with your maker." Hollis was paralyzed, trapped between the present horror and the resurrected trauma of his past. The silver locket glinted again, a malevolent star connecting 2 unforgivable moments in his life. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Suddenly, from outside, came a tremendous crash of splintering wood and a gush of water followed by the panicked whinnying of horses. Morrison's mount reared violently, yanking its reins free. The distraction was jarring, absolute. Morrison cursed and spun toward the door, his attention momentarily broken. In that single blessed instant, Thomas Reed scrambled for the back room, disappearing from sight. Through the doorway, Hollis saw the source of the commotion. A woman impossibly tall stood beside the overturned horse trough, water pooling around her sturdy boots. She was nearly a head taller than any man on the street, with shoulders as broad as a lumberjack's. She calmly righted a fallen bucket as if she were merely tidying up her yard, her expression unreadable. It was Prudence Hollister, the stranger who had arrived in town 2 days prior. "We're blown," one of the other robbers shouted. Morrison shot a final furious glare toward Hollis's desk, a promise of unfinished business in his eyes. Then he and his men scrambled onto their spooked horses and galloped out of town, leaving behind a trail of dust and a silence thick with shock. Hollis remained on the floor, shaking the image of the silver locket burned onto the back of his eyes. He didn't know it yet, but the man who had orphaned him 15 years ago had just walked back into his life. And the strange, towering woman who had just saved the bank manager was about to turn his meticulously ordered world upside down forever. The afternoon sun baked the dust on Main Street into a hard, cracked shell. In the days following the robbery, an uneasy quiet settled over Redemption. But for Hollis, the world had been knocked permanently off its axis. He spent his hours in the suffocating neatness of his office, and the scent of ink and old paper a poor defense against the intrusive smell of gunpowder from his memory. He tried to lose himself in his ledgers, the columns of figures that had always been his sanctuary. But now they seemed to mock him. He saw Morrison sneer in the profit margins of the cattle sales he managed for him. He saw the glint of the locket in the polished brass of his inkwell. His life, once a model of predictable order, now felt like a fragile facade built unwittingly on a foundation of violence and deceit. Hollis Vane had cultivated a reputation for being a reliable man. It was more than a professional asset. It was his identity. His office was a testament to this, with every pen in its holder, every file labeled and squared away. This order was his armor against the chaos that had shattered his childhood. After the wagon attack, he had been found wandering the plains mute with shock and brought to Redemption by a circuit preacher. He had rebuilt himself from nothing, learning to find safety in structure and solace in precision. The townsfolk respected him for it. They saw a quiet, steady man who attended church, never missed a deadline, and kept their financial secrets locked away tighter than the vault in Reed's bank. But the robbery had exposed a crack in his armor, and through it the past was leaking in. He now saw the town not as a sanctuary, but as a web of quiet allegiances he had never bothered to understand. He saw the way Mayor Wickham, a man whose public persona was all blustering incompetence, would fall silent and deferential whenever Jim Morrison entered a room. He saw how Thomas Reed, the bank manager he'd nearly seen executed, was back to sharing cigars with Morrison on the hotel porch, as if nothing had happened. Morrison wasn't just a rancher. He was the sun around which the town's powerful men orbited, and Hollis, with his neat ledgers, had been helping to map their corrupt constellations without ever looking up at the sky. 3 days after the robbery, his door opened without a knock. Prudence Hollister filled the frame her height, forcing her to duck slightly to enter. She moved with a deliberate, quiet grace that seemed at odds with her formidable size. The office, which had always felt spacious to Hollis, suddenly seemed small and crowded. She closed the door behind her, the soft click of the latch sounding unnervingly final. "Mr. Vane," she began, her voice a low, steady contralto. "We need to talk." Hollis straightened his vest, a nervous habit. "Miss Hollister, I never had the chance to thank you for what you did at the bank." "I didn't do it for you," she stated bluntly, dismissing his gratitude. "I did it because Morrison getting arrested by a local sheriff for bank robbery would have been inconvenient." She walked to his window, her gaze sweeping over the dusty street. "They're getting nervous. Morrison Reed, the mayor. Your meticulous work has made them rich, but a man who knows all their secrets is a liability, especially when he's just been given a reason to start asking questions." Hollis felt a chill despite the afternoon heat. "I'm just an accountant." "You're the key," she corrected, turning to face him. The scar that ran from her left ear to her jaw was a faint, silvery line against her sun-weathered skin. "And right now, you're in more danger than you can possibly imagine." She laid a folded piece of paper on his desk. It was a wanted poster, the ink still fresh. The sketch was crude but unmistakable. It depicted her. The text below offered a $500 reward for the capture of a dangerous female fugitive. I am a detective for the Union Pacific Railroad. She explained, her voice devoid of emotion. For the better part of a year, I have been investigating a land-grabbing scheme orchestrated by a consortium of powerful men. They use threats and violence to drive ranchers off their land, then use corrupt federal marshals to legitimize the seizures. Morrison is the head of this territory's operation. He launders his profits through legitimate businesses, your businesses. The pieces began to click into place with sickening clarity. The inexplicable fires at rival ranches, the families who sold their land for a fraction of its worth and left town overnight. Hollis had recorded the transactions, balanced the books, and never once questioned the story behind the numbers. The marshals you saw me with in Denver, she continued, they were my partners, or so I thought. They're on Morrison's payroll. They know I have the evidence to expose them all, ledgers, sworn affidavits, everything. So they fabricated a murder charge against me in Colorado to discredit my testimony and put a price on my head. They're on their way here now. They won't try to arrest me, Mr. Vane. They'll kill me to silence me, and they'll kill you because of what you might know. Hollis sank into his chair, the meticulously ordered world he had built crumbling around him. What do you want from me? Prudence's expression was pragmatic, almost clinical. I need a shield. A legal complication they can't easily bypass. I am proposing a marriage of convenience. Hollis stared at her, certain he had misheard. A marriage. Under territorial law. She said, her tone as precise as one of his ledger entries. A husband has significant legal standing. He has the right to defend his wife and his property. Any action taken against me would legally have to involve you. They can't simply shoot a fugitive if she's the lawful wife of a respected town citizen. It would require warrants, court orders, due process. It creates a delay. And right now, a delay is the only thing that can keep us both alive. Hollis's mind, accustomed to logic and rules, reeled from the sheer audacity of the proposal. A legal arrangement of this nature requires justification, witnesses, a preacher. What precisely are the statutes you're invoking? Statutes won't stop a bullet. Prudence countered, her voice hardening with impatience. A husband can. They want me dead and my proof buried. I need a name they can't erase. I need your name, Hollis. Your reputation is the only armor I have left. She wasn't asking him. She was presenting him with an ultimatum. On one side was his quiet, orderly, and ultimately doomed life. On the other was a terrifying leap into the unknown, with a fugitive detective who was his only chance at survival. He looked at her, at the weary resolve in her eyes, and saw a reflection of his own desperate need for sanctuary. His was built of paper and ink. Hers was built of law and desperate gambles. He thought of the locket, of the 15 years he had spent hiding from his past. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding. There's a preacher who owes me a favor. Hollis said, his own voice surprising him with its steadiness. And witnesses can be found. It seems, Miss Hollister, that you are about to acquire a husband. Their wedding was a hurried, surreal affair conducted in the back room of the saloon, and the air thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. The preacher, a man whose gambling debts Hollis had discreetly settled, mumbled the words with nervous haste. 2 prospectors paid $1 each for their signatures served as witnesses, their bewildered expressions mirroring Hollis's own inner turmoil. Within 10 minutes, he was a married man, bound by law to a towering stranger who held the fate of both their lives in a worn leather satchel. They had no time for ceremony. The next morning, as Hollis was attempting to reconcile the most chaotic entry of his life's ledger, the sharp rap on his office door announced the arrival of the first obstacle. Morrison didn't wait for an invitation. He strode in flanked by a man with a cruel pinched face and a silver star pinned to his vest. Marshall Cooper. Vain. Morrison began his voice, oozing a false cordiality that did nothing to hide the menace in his eyes. I see you've acquired a companion. He gestured dismissively toward Prudence, who stood near the window, her arms crossed, her presence a silent, immovable challenge. Marshall Cooper stepped forward, a warrant clutched in his hand. Hollis Vane. I have a warrant for the arrest of one Prudence Hollister, a fugitive wanted for murder in the Colorado Territory. As she is currently on your property, I am ordering you to surrender her to my custody. The legal assault was direct, brutal. Hollis's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to meet the marshal's gaze. This was his first test. Morrison leaned against the doorframe, the picture of casual power. Now, Hollis, we all know you're a reasonable man. You've gotten yourself mixed up in something that doesn't concern you. A simple mistake. Annul this sham of a marriage, turn the woman over, and I'll make sure Mr. Reed at the bank overlooks any irregularities in my accounts that you might have been unwittingly managing. A clean slate, for old time's sake. The offer was a lifeline and a threat wrapped in one. It was a chance to return to his quiet, orderly world, to pretend the last few days had never happened. But as he looked at Prudence, he saw not a fugitive, but an ally. And he saw the silver locket in his mind's eye, a reminder that Morrison's world was built on the ashes of his own. He took the warrant from Cooper's hand, his own hand surprisingly steady. His eyes scanned the document, his accountant's mind automatically searching for errors, for loopholes. Marshall. He began, his voice gaining strength as he fell back on the familiar comfort of rules and regulations. This warrant appears to be in order, however it is made out for Prudence Hollister. Cooper frowned. That's her name. It was her name. Hollis corrected, a spark of defiance igniting within him. As of yesterday, her legal name is Prudence Vane. She is my wife. This warrant therefore does not apply to the person standing in this room. Furthermore, under Territorial Ordinance 7 Section 4, a husband's property, which includes his home and place of business, cannot be entered by law enforcement for the purpose of seizing a spouse without a superseding writ, signed by a circuit judge citing specific evidence of the husband's complicity. This warrant cites no such evidence. Silence descended on the room. Morrison's smile faltered. Cooper stared at the warrant, then at Hollis, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. He had expected a timid bookkeeper, not a man who could weaponize territorial law. You're playing games, Vane, Cooper snarled. I am observing the law, Marshal, Hollis replied coolly. Something you, of all people, should appreciate. Until you can produce the correct paperwork, my wife and I will remain here, unmolested. He handed the useless warrant back to the marshal. For a moment, it seemed Cooper might draw his weapon. The tension in the small office was a physical force. But Prudence shifted her weight, a subtle movement that drew both men's attention to her formidable size and the cold, unblinking promise in her eyes. She hadn't said a word, but her message was clear. Morrison pushed himself off the doorframe, his jovial mask gone, replaced by undisguised rage. You made your choice, Vane, he hissed. You'll regret it. With a final venomous glare, he and Cooper departed, slamming the door behind them. The immediate threat had passed, but Hollis knew this was only the beginning. He had publicly chosen his side. He had defied Jim Morrison. His quiet, orderly life was over. He looked at Prudence, who gave him a slow, appraising nod. It wasn't praise, but it was respect. Their alliance, born of convenience and forged in defiance, was now real. The days that followed were a blur of whispered conversations and watchful nights. Hollis's office became their fortress, the windows shuttered, the door barred. The first flush of defiance gave way to a gnawing fear. They had won a battle of wits, but Morrison and his marshals commanded an army. "They'll be back," Prudence said one evening, cleaning her revolver by the low light of a single lantern. "And they won't bring paperwork next time." "Then we can't wait for them." Hollis replied the words feeling foreign and bold on his tongue. He was no longer just reacting. He was thinking like a strategist. "You have evidence, but it's not enough to protect us. We need more. We need something so damning they can't afford to let it see the light of day." An idea began to form in his mind, rooted in the one skill he truly possessed. "Morrison thinks my ledgers are my weakness, the proof of my complicity. What if they're his?" For the next 2 days, Hollis worked with a feverish intensity he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just balancing books anymore. He was hunting. With Prudence standing guard, he retrieved his client files from the office safe. Spreading them across his desk, he began a forensic audit of Jim Morrison's entire financial history and redemption. He cross-referenced cattle sales with shipping manifests, land purchases with tax records, and payroll disbursements with town census data. Prudence, looking over his shoulder, provided the context he lacked, connecting names to deeds, dates to disappearances. Slowly, a horrifying tapestry of corruption emerged from the neat columns of figures. He found ghost employees on Morrison's payroll men who didn't exist, their wages likely kickbacks for the marshals. He discovered land deeds signed over on the very same days their previous owners had been reported as moving back east. And then he found the core of the deception, a pattern of cattle sales. Morrison would report selling a herd of, say, 200 head, and Hollis would dutifully record the income. But railroad shipping dockets, which Prudence had acquired, would show a shipment of 400 head leaving Morrison's ranch on the same day. The extra 200 were stolen cattle, their brands altered, absorbed into the legitimate herd, and sold for pure, untraceable profit. The numbers in his own ledgers, which he had so prided himself on, were the very tools of the crime. The realization left him feeling sick and hollow. He had been Morrison's most valuable and most ignorant accomplice. "This is good," Prudence said, her finger tracing a particularly flagrant discrepancy. "But it's still just numbers on a page. We need a human witness, someone the town trusts." Hollis knew immediately who she meant. Sheriff Barlow was a man carved from the same weathered wood as the town he served. He was old, grizzled, and had a reputation for being stubbornly, if quietly, honest. He had long distrusted Morrison, but lacked the resources or authority to challenge a man with federal marshals in his pocket. They met him after midnight in the back of the livery stable, the air thick with the smell of hay and manure. Hollis laid out his findings, his voice low and urgent. Barlow listened intently, his rheumy eyes missing nothing, his hand stroking his gray mustache. "I knew it." Barlow sighed when Hollis had finished. "Felt it in my bones for years. Morrison's got this town in a stranglehold, but proof like this?" He tapped the ledger sheet. "This changes things, but it also puts you both at the top of his list to be buried." He looked from Hollis to Prudence. "Cooper and his boys have been patrolling the edge of town every night. They're not looking for a fugitive. They're hunting." His words proved prophetic. 2 nights later, acting on a tip from Barlow that the marshals were planning a raid on the office, they fled into the Badlands. Under the cold light of a sliver moon, they navigated the treacherous landscape of canyons and rock formations. The chase was a terrifying game of cat and mouse. They'd hide in narrow ravines, holding their breath as the sound of hoofbeats passed nearby, the casual conversation of the marshals carrying on the still night air. During one such moment, huddled behind a rock outcropping, the tension and shared danger cracked open a piece of Prudence's guarded past. My family had a farm in the Nebraska Territory. She said, her voice barely a whisper. Good land. My father built it from nothing. She paused, her gaze lost in the star-dusted darkness. A man like Morrison came along. He wanted the water rights. He tried to buy us out. My father refused. A week later, our barn burned down. The week after that, our well was poisoned. The local law was on his payroll. We lost everything. Is that why you became a detective? Hollis asked softly. I learned a hard lesson, Hollis. She said, her voice tight with old pain. The law is only as good as the people who enforce it. I decided I was going to be one of the good ones. I fight for the people like my father, the ones who have nowhere else to turn. Her fight was not just professional. It was a deeply personal crusade for justice. Hollis felt a profound connection to her, then a shared understanding of loss and the long shadow it casts. Their escapes grew narrower. Morrison, frustrated by their elusiveness, began to play a more psychological game. During a brief, necessary trip into town for supplies, Hollis came face to face with him on the street. Morrison tipped his hat, a cruel smirk on his face. You know Vane, he said, his voice low enough for only Hollis to hear. You have your father's eyes. He was a man who always saw the angles, a real head for numbers, right until the very end. The casual, veiled reference hit Hollis like a physical blow. Morrison was not just threatening him. He was taunting him, dangling the shared, unspoken horror of the past between them. Hollis hurried away, his heart pounding, the pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed beginning to swirl in his mind. Why would Morrison mention his father? How could he possibly know what his father was like? The questions echoed in his head, building a terrible suspense around the true nature of their connection, a truth far more monstrous than he could ever have imagined. The answer was hidden in plain sight, locked away in the one place Hollis had never dared to look: Jim Morrison's main ranch office. It was a desperate, foolhardy plan, but it was their only option left. While Sheriff Barlow created a diversion, drawing Morrison and the marshals to a staged cattle rustling on the far side of the valley, Hollis and Prudence slipped onto the ranch under the cover of darkness. Morrison's office was a monument to his ego, all dark wood, polished leather, and the mounted heads of animals staring down with glassy eyes. Prudence stood guard at the door, while Hollis went to work on the large iron safe. His delicate accountant's fingers, accustomed to the subtle mechanics of pens and abacuses, proved surprisingly adept at discerning the faint clicks of the tumblers. The heavy door swung open with a groan. Inside, among stacks of cash and deeds, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. This was it, Morrison's private record, the one that would detail all the transactions he kept out of the books Hollis managed. It was the proof they needed. But beneath the ledger was something else. A small wood-inlaid box. Hollis lifted the lid, his breath catching in his throat. Inside was his mother's silver locket. He stared at it, the intricately carved hawk seeming to mock him. A wave of nausea and white-hot rage washed over him. He reached for it, but his fingers brushed against something else tucked into the velvet lining of the box, a small, worn journal, its leather cover faded with age. He recognized the elegant, precise handwriting immediately. It was his father's. With trembling hands, he opened it. It was a trail journal detailing their family's journey west. He read about their hopes, their dreams for the land they would settle, a place they had already named Redemption Valley. And then he found the entry that changed everything. October 14th. A difficult day. I have long held suspicions about our traveling partner, young Jim Morrison. He is ambitious and charming, but there is a darkness in him. Today I found proof. He has been systematically stealing supplies, flour medicine, salted meat from the other families in our wagon train, and selling them at inflated prices at the forts we pass. He has built his starting stake on the quiet suffering of others. I confronted him. He did not deny it. He tried to offer me a share to make me a partner in his deceit. I refused. I have told him that I will be turning him over to the commander at Fort Laramie. It is my duty. He took the news quietly. Too quietly. I do not trust his silence. The journal slipped from Hollis's fingers. The world tilted, the carefully constructed walls of his reality shattering into a million pieces. The attack. It wasn't a random raid by natives or bandits, the story he had been told and had clung to for 15 years. It was an ambush. An execution. Morrison had orchestrated the attack to silence his father, to prevent him from reaching Fort Laramie. He had murdered his parents and stolen not just their possessions, but their shared future. The final devastating piece of the puzzle fell into place. Morrison's obsession with this specific valley, with the town of Redemption, wasn't just about greed. This was the very land his father and Morrison had planned to settle together. Morrison had built his empire on the stolen dream of the man he had murdered, and his vendetta against Hollis wasn't just about covering his tracks. It was about erasing the last living remnant of his original sin. It was about silencing the ghost of a partner he had betrayed. Hollis looked up, his eyes meeting Prudence's. She saw the devastation on his face and knew without him saying a word that this was no longer a fight for land or justice. It had become a deeply personal war for retribution, 15 years in the making. The revelation in Morrison's office changed the very air Hollis breathed. The weight of his grief, long buried under years of quiet routine, now burned with the righteous fire of vengeance. When they returned to the safety of Sheriff Barlow's office, the stolen ledger and his father's journal laid out on the desk, the fight was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name, and a history written in his own blood. Morrison, returning from the false alarm to find his safe cracked and his secret stolen, could no longer afford subtlety. He couldn't risk a quiet bullet in the dark. That would only confirm the suspicions of the few people like Barlow who were watching him. He needed to destroy Hollis publicly, to obliterate his reputation so thoroughly that no one would ever believe a word he said. He needed to turn the town of Redemption against its most reliable man. The rumor started as a whisper in the general store and spread like a brush fire. Hollis Vane, the meticulous town accountant, had been embezzling money for years. Not just from Morrison, but from everyone: the blacksmith, the baker, the small-time ranchers who trusted him with their life savings. The timing was perfect. Morrison, through his control of supplies and loans from the bank, had been engineering a quiet financial squeeze on the town for months. People were struggling, and they needed someone to blame. And the fugitive woman, Prudence. She wasn't a detective. She was his partner in crime, a hardened criminal he had brought in to help him escape with the town's money. The story was simple, believable, and it played on everyone's deepest fears. Their quiet, unassuming bookkeeper was a viper they had welcomed into their homes. By midday, the whispers had become a roar. An angry crowd gathered on Main Street, their faces pinched with fear and betrayal. Hollis watched from the grimy window of the sheriff's office as Mrs. Clemens, the baker's wife, to whom he had extended credit just last month, pointed a trembling finger at their refuge. The blacksmith whose children's education fund Hollis had helped establish held a hammer in his hand, his knuckles white. They were not just a mob. They were his neighbors, his clients, and the very people he had served for 15 years. "He's turned them all," Barlow said grimly, checking the load in his shotgun. "Morrison's telling them you stole their savings, that you're the reason they can't make ends meet. It's easier to hate you than to face the truth." The siege began. Rocks shattered the windows of the sheriff's office. Angry shouts echoed in the street. "Thief! Give us our money, Vane. Send out the killer." They were trapped, Hollis, Prudence, and the aging sheriff, an island of truth in a sea of manufactured lies. The confrontation was no longer about a strange marriage or a land-grabbing scheme. It was about their very survival against a town that had been convinced they were the enemy. "We can't fight them all," Hollis said, his voice strained, watching the crowd swell. "We don't have to," Prudence replied, her calm, a steadying presence in the chaos. She was checking her revolver, her movements economical and precise. "We just have to outlast them. A mob's anger burns hot, but it burns fast. Morrison is counting on them doing his dirty work before they have a chance to think. But Morrison wasn't going to give them a chance to think. He appeared at the edge of the crowd, climbing onto a wagon bed to address the townsfolk. He held up account books, forgeries Hollis realized with a sickening lurch, that supposedly detailed Hollis's crimes. "Friends, neighbors." Morrison boomed, his voice resonating with false sympathy. "This man, Hollis Vane, has betrayed your trust. He and that fugitive murderer have bled this town dry. The law is too slow. We, the people of redemption, must deliver our own justice." A rope appeared, tossed from hand to hand over the heads of the crowd until it reached the front. The intent was clear, brutal, and final. They were no longer just under siege. They were cornered with the whole world baying for their blood, orchestrated by the man who had destroyed Hollis's life once before and was now determined to finish the job. The siege on the sheriff's office stretched into the night, the flickering torchlight outside, painting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. The mob's fury had settled into a grim, patient cordon. They were waiting. Inside, the air was stale with the smell of gunpowder and fear. The final confrontation was inevitable. It came not with a frontal assault, but with treachery. Under the cover of the mob's noise, 2 of Morrison's men scaled the back of the building. A crash of wood from the rear storeroom was their only warning. Before Barlow could react, the back door burst open. In the ensuing chaos, Hollis was clubbed from behind the world, exploding in a shower of black stars. He awoke to the biting sting of cold rain on his face and the roar of a world gone mad. He was outside, his hands bound tightly behind his back. Morrison was dragging him through the mud toward the edge of town, toward the half-finished railroad bridge that spanned the churning, flood-swollen Redemption River. The storm that had been threatening all evening had finally broken, unleashing a torrent of biblical proportions. Thunder cracked overhead, and flashes of lightning illuminated a scene from a nightmare. An unfortunate accident. Morrison shouted over the wind, his face a mask of triumphant fury. The embezzler Vane tried to escape. He slipped and fell from the bridge in the storm, a tragedy. He shoved Hollis onto the slick, treacherous beams of the bridge. Below the river was a brown, raging monster filled with debris. There was no escape. But then a figure emerged from the storm's fury. Prudence. She must have fought her way out of the office. She stood at the opposite end of the bridge, her revolver held steady in her 2 hands, her towering frame silhouetted against a flash of lightning. "Let him go, Morrison," she yelled, her voice cutting through the gale. Suddenly, they were no longer alone. Marshal Cooper and his 2 deputies appeared on the embankment, their guns drawn. But they weren't aimed at Prudence. They were aimed at everyone. "Sorry, Jim," Cooper shouted. "Loose ends. The railroad already knows too much. We can't have any witnesses." It was a 3-way standoff, played out on a narrow stage high above a roaring abyss, the world tearing itself apart around them. A battle for survival, justice, and revenge, all converging in a single, desperate moment. Morrison laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "You think you've won." He pulled Hollis closer, pressing the cold barrel of his pistol to his temple. He held up the leather satchel containing all of Prudence's evidence, the ledgers, the affidavits, his father's journal. "This is what you came for, isn't it? Proof?" With a contemptuous flick of his wrist, he hurled the satchel into the storm. It spun through the air and was swallowed instantly by the raging river below. "Now, there is no proof," he screamed in triumph. "Just stories, my word against a dead detective and a disgraced accountant." The evidence was gone. The legal path to justice was washed away. The realization was a gut punch, a secondary twist that left them with nothing but raw violence as an option. But Morrison had underestimated Hollis. The timid bookkeeper was gone, burned away by grief and rage. What was left was the son of a man who had faced this same evil and had not backed down. He would not use a gun. He would use the one weapon Morrison could not destroy: the truth. "You're wrong," Hollis said, his voice calm and clear amidst the storm's chaos. "The proof isn't in that bag. It's in me." He looked Morrison directly in the eye, not with fear, but with a cold, burning certainty. "He was my father. His name was Daniel Vane, and he wrote about you in his journal." Morrison's triumphant expression faltered. "He wrote that you had a darkness in you." Hollis continued, his voice rising, reciting the words now seared into his memory. "He wrote that he was going to turn you in at Fort Laramie. He called it his duty, and you murdered him for it. You ambushed our wagon. You ripped a silver locket from my mother's neck before you killed her." Each word was a hammer blow. This wasn't an accusation. It was a ghost's testimony. Morrison staggered back, as if struck, his face contorting with a rage born of 15 years of buried guilt. He was a fool. Morrison roared, his confession erupting from him raw and absolute. "He would have ruined me, ruined everything I built, this, all of it. It should have been ours, but he was too righteous, too weak. I took what was mine." The world seemed to hold its breath. In a flash of lightning, Hollis saw them, Sheriff Barlow and a small posse of ranchers, the ones who hadn't joined the mob, standing on the riverbank, their rifles raised. They had heard it all. The confession broke the spell. Cooper, realizing the game was up, fired at Morrison. The bullet went wide, and the bridge exploded into a desperate, brutal battle. In the chaos, Hollis threw his weight backward, sending both himself and a surprised Morrison stumbling. Prudence charged forward, disarming one of the deputies with a powerful blow. The final fight was a frantic scramble on the slick, narrow beams. It ended when Sheriff Barlow's rifle cracked the shot, taking Marshal Cooper cleanly in the arm. Morrison, lunging for Hollis one last time, lost his footing on the rain-slicked wood. He teetered on the edge for one horrifying moment, his eyes wide with shock before plunging into the torrent below. The river swallowed him without a trace. Justice, in the end, had been delivered not by a rope or a bullet, but by the storm itself. In the days following the storm, a profound quiet settled over the town of Redemption. The rain had washed the streets clean, and the sun seemed to shine on a different world. The truth witnessed by Barlow and his posse spread through the community like a slow-acting antidote to Morrison's poison. Territorial authorities summoned by telegrams Prudence had sent before the siege arrived to find a town grappling with its own soul. They arrested Cooper and his deputies, their corruption exposed beyond any doubt. The ranchers Morrison had cheated were promised restitution. The town, chastened and ashamed, began the quiet, difficult work of healing. The real healing for Hollis began a week later at a small, windswept cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley. He had never had the courage to visit the two simple, unmarked graves before. He had not known what to say. But now, with Prudence standing a respectful distance away, he finally found the words. "Father, Mother," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I know what happened now. I know you were murdered by a man you trusted. And I know you died because you were good and honorable." He knelt and placed a hand on the cool earth. "I'm sorry it took me so long to face it. I spent my whole life hiding, trying to build order out of the chaos he created. But I'm not hiding anymore." He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the valley, their valley. "I will live the life you wanted for us. Here, in this place. I will make redemption a name it deserves." When he stood up, he felt a peace he had never known, as if a weight he had carried for 15 years had finally been lifted. He walked over to Prudence, who watched him with an expression of deep understanding. Their marriage had been a contract, a legal maneuver born of desperation. But somewhere in the shared danger, in the quiet moments of trust, and the final desperate battle on the bridge, it had become something more. "The railroad has officially closed my case," she said quietly. "They've offered me a permanent position head of the Western Division. It's based in Denver." Hollis nodded, a knot tightening in his stomach. "It's what you've worked for. You've earned it." "It's a good life," she agreed. "Safe, respected." She paused, her eyes searching his. "But it's a lonely one. My fight is over. I don't know what comes next." Hollis took a breath, stepping into the unknown one last time. "Our marriage started as part of your investigation. It doesn't have to end there." He looked at her, not at the towering detective who had saved his life, but at the woman who had seen the strength he never knew he possessed. "You want to stay married, even knowing what I am?" Prudence's lips curved into a soft, genuine smile. "I know exactly what you are, Hollis Vane. You're the man who faced down Jim Morrison with nothing but the truth. You're stronger and braver than anyone in this town." She reached out and took his hand, her large, scarred fingers enveloping his. "My whole life has been about running toward the fight. Maybe it's time I had a reason to run home." In that quiet moment on a hill overlooking the town, they had saved their contract, became a vow. They chose to stay together, not out of necessity, but out of a shared respect that was beginning to feel remarkably like love. 6 months later, the town of Redemption was transformed. With Morrison's corrupt empire dismantled, the railroad grateful to Hollis, and Prudence had invested heavily in the community as a gesture of goodwill. The ranches were restored to their rightful owners, the bank was recapitalized, and a new sense of hope had taken root in the rich soil of the valley. Hollis and Prudence, instead of moving to Denver, had chosen to stay. They had bought a small plot of land at the edge of town, and their modest house was the first thing travelers saw when they arrived. Hollis had reopened his accounting office, but now he served as a financial advisor to the entire community, ensuring that no one could ever again exploit the townspeople through ignorance or fear. Prudence, while officially retired from the railroad, had become an unofficial guardian of the town's peace, her mere presence a deterrent to any would-be troublemakers. The final act of the town's rebirth was the dedication of the new schoolhouse. It was built on a piece of land Hollis had donated, funded by the assets recovered from Morrison's estate. The entire town had gathered for the ceremony, their faces bright with optimism. As the final cornerstone was about to be laid, Hollis stepped forward. He held in his hand the silver locket recovered from Morrison's lockbox and polished until it shone. It was no longer a symbol of loss and trauma. It was a testament to survival, a relic of a past that had been faced and overcome. He spoke to the crowd, his voice steady and clear. This locket belonged to my mother. It was taken from her on the day our family's journey to this valley was cut short. For a long time, it represented everything I had lost. But today, he said, looking at Prudence, who stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, it represents everything that can be built from a painful past. With a sense of finality and peace, he placed the locket into the hollowed-out space within the cornerstone. As the mason sealed it in, he was not burying his past, but making it the foundation of a better future. The locket, with its soaring hawk, would forever be a part of redemption, a hidden symbol of the price that had been paid for this new beginning. Prudence squeezed his hand. They were no longer just a bookkeeper and a detective, a strange marriage born of convenience. They were partners, builders, the heart of a community they had saved and helped to remake. As the sun set, casting long golden rays across the valley, they stood together, looking out over the town that was finally truly living up to its name.